For nearly half the flight, the crying never stopped. In first class, Victor Langford sat stiff-backed in his leather seat, his infant son screaming in his arms while irritation rippled through the cabin. The luxury around him only made it worse. Soft lighting, quiet murmurs, eyes that judged instead of helped. Victor had tried everything: rocking, walking, bottles, whispers through clenched teeth. Nothing worked. Money couldn't buy silence, authority couldn't command comfort, and pride only deepened the humiliation. Passengers exchanged looks, a few complained aloud. Flight attendant Sarah Whitman offered suggestions with thinning patience. Somewhere behind them, Mr. Raymond Cole watched the scene unfold, sensing something was about to snap. Then, from the back of the plane, a figure moved. A poor boy, young, hesitant, clearly out of place, stepped into the aisle and walked forward. No announcement, no confidence borrowed from status, just intention. As Charles Williams reached first class, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Victor looked up, exhausted, unsure whether to stop him. He didn't. And in the next moment, everything changed. Before you begin, please take a moment to relax and enjoy the story. If you find it engaging, do me a small favor. Subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. I'd also love to hear from you, so feel free to comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your support means a lot and helps grow our community. The cry cut through first class like a blade. It started as a soft whimper, the kind Victor Langford barely noticed at first. He adjusted Leo against his chest, instinctively confident, the way a man confident in everything else always was. This was supposed to be easy: a private terminal, priority boarding, seat 2A, silence, control. Then the whimper became a scream. Not a brief protest, not a passing discomfort. It was raw, piercing, relentless. The kind of cry that refused to be ignored, that climbed over the plush leather seats, slipped past noise-canceling headphones, and settled deep into the nerves of every passenger in the cabin. Victor felt the shift immediately. He bounced Leo gently. Nothing. He rocked him, whispering reassurances that usually worked at home. The scream only grew louder, Leo's tiny face reddening, fists clenching as if the entire world had wronged him. Victor glanced around, expecting patience, sympathy maybe. Instead, he met eyes sharp with irritation. A woman across the aisle sighed loudly and turned away. A man 2 rows ahead removed his headphones, disbelief etched across his face. Someone muttered something under their breath. Another pressed the call button with unnecessary force. Victor's jaw tightened. He tried again. A bottle. Rejected. A pacifier? Thrown aside with surprising strength. He stood, pacing the narrow aisle of first class, the baby's cries echoing off polished surfaces that usually absorbed nothing but quiet privilege. This wasn't happening. Victor Langford did not lose control in public. He commanded rooms. He negotiated billion-dollar deals without raising his voice. Yet here, suspended 30,000 feet above the ground, his power meant nothing. The cry continued. Minutes gasped, then more. The tension thickened, pressing in from all sides. The luxury that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating, like velvet-lined walls closing in. Victor's arms began to ache, sweat forming beneath his collar despite the cool cabin air. Sarah Whitman approached with a careful smile that didn't quite hide her concern. She offered suggestions softly, professionally, but her eyes flicked past Victor to the other passengers, measuring their patience as it thinned. "I'm doing everything," Victor snapped before he could stop himself. Sarah nodded, unoffended, and stepped back. The cry did not stop. Whispers spread like static. Complaints followed. A man leaned into the aisle and spoke too loudly about inconsiderate parents. Someone else laughed humorlessly. Victor caught the gaze of an older gentleman a few rows back, Mr. Raymond Cole, who wasn't glaring like the others. He was watching, studying the scene with a quiet intensity that made Victor uneasy. Humiliation crept in, slow and poisonous. Victor sat down again, gripping Leo more tightly than he meant to. The baby's cry cracked, then surged back stronger as if feeding on the tension. Victor felt eyes burning into him from every direction. He imagined headlines, mockery, judgment, the billionaire who couldn't even control his own child. For the first time in years, he felt small. He lowered his head, voice strained as he whispered apologies to no one in particular. He checked his watch, absurdly, as if time might save him. Nothing did. The cry owned the cabin now. It set the rhythm of the flight, the mood, the collective frustration. Luxury had turned against him. From beyond the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, movement stirred. He didn't notice at first. He was too busy fighting the rising panic in his chest, the sharp realization that no amount of money could buy silence in this moment. But someone else noticed. Mr. Cole's eyes shifted toward the aisle. A figure stood uncertainly near the divide between classes, hesitating, then stepping back, as if reconsidering. The cry continued, unbroken, echoing down the aircraft. Victor closed his eyes. He had never felt so exposed. And somewhere behind him, unseen by most, a decision was forming, quiet, risky, and powerful enough to change everything. The cries kept coming, unbroken, drilling into the cabin like an accusation no one could escape. Patience dissolved quickly after that. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Isn't there something that can be done?" he asked no one in particular, though his eyes never left Victor. Another passenger shook her head openly, whispering to her seatmate with exaggerated gestures. Someone laughed, not kindly. Someone else rolled their eyes and pressed their headphones back on, as if insulted that luxury had failed them. Victor felt every reaction like a spotlight. He shifted Leo again, murmuring soft reassurances that sounded weaker each time. The baby's cries cracked and surged, tiny lungs working furiously, oblivious to the social storm he had unleashed. Victor's face burned. He could feel judgment crawling over him, not just annoyance, but a strange satisfaction from those who were enjoying his discomfort. The mighty brought low. Sarah Whitman returned, her professionalism strained at the edges. She offered warm towels, suggested a different hold, asked gently if Victor wanted to walk Leo farther back. The suggestion felt like exile. "I've got it," Victor said, too quickly. The words sounded hollow. Behind the irritation, something darker stirred among the passengers. Resentment. First class wasn't supposed to feel like this. They had paid for silence, exclusivity, distance from inconvenience, and yet here it was, screaming in their ears, daring them to acknowledge that wealth didn't grant immunity from chaos. Voices rose. "This is unacceptable. Some people have no consideration. They should move him." Each comment landed like a blow. Victor stared straight ahead, jaw locked, pretending not to hear. He focused on the rhythmic hum of the engines, on Leo's tiny fingers gripping his suit, on anything that kept him from snapping. He had never been this powerless in public, never this exposed to strangers' opinions. A few rows back, Mr. Raymond Cole watched quietly. He didn't complain, he didn't glare. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the entire scene. Victor's stiff posture, the way his confidence eroded with each passing minute, the subtle cruelty in the passengers' whispers. Raymond noticed details others missed, how Victor never once raised his voice at the child, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking, how desperation had replaced pride. Raymond's gaze drifted past first class toward the thin curtain separating privilege from the rest of the plane. He noticed a boy there. Charles Williams stood half-hidden in the aisle near economy, clutching the strap of his worn backpack. His clothes were simple, clean but faded. His eyes weren't on Victor. They were on the baby, focused, concerned, as if the cries meant something personal to him. Charles shifted his weight, uncertain. He glanced around, catching the scowls and impatient gestures from first-class passengers. He took a small step forward, then stopped. The invisible boundary felt heavier than the aircraft itself. Up front, Victor's composure cracked further. He lowered his head, shoulders slumping as Leo's cries echoed on. The humiliation was no longer just external, it had sunk inside him. This was no longer about noise, it was about being judged, stripped of the respect he was accustomed to commanding without question. Sarah Whitman received another complaint, this one sharper, less polite. She nodded, murmuring apologies, her eyes flicking back to Victor with something close to pity. Raymond leaned back in his seat, folding his hands thoughtfully. He had seen moments like this before, not on planes, but in life. Moments when people revealed who they really were under pressure. Moments when assumptions were challenged, whether anyone wanted them to be or not. He looked again at the boy near the curtain. Charles's face tightened with resolve. His fingers loosened from his backpack strap. The cries hadn't softened, but something in him had hardened instead. A quiet determination replaced hesitation. Raymond felt it then, the sense that the real turning point of the flight hadn't happened yet. Up front, Victor lifted his eyes just in time to notice movement in the aisle behind him. He didn't turn fully. He was too tired, too drained to hope for anything different. But somewhere between judgment and desperation, between privilege and invisibility, something was shifting, and every pair of eyes in first class, whether they realized it or not, was about to be forced to look again. Victor Langford had faced crises that made headlines tremble and markets flinch. He had stared down rivals twice his size and bent outcomes to his will through strategy, money, and timing. Control was his language, influence his currency. None of it mattered now. Leo's cries had taken on a ragged edge, rising and falling like waves that refused to break. Victor sat back down heavily, his expensive suit creased, his confidence unraveling stitch by stitch. He'd checked his phone out of habit, thumb hovering uselessly over a screen that could summon private jets and emergency meetings, but not relief. What good was power if it couldn't calm his own child? He tried again, slower this time, adjusted Leo's position, counted his breaths, whispered promises he wasn't sure he believed. The baby's face scrunched tighter, the scream sharper, as if rejecting every attempt outright. Victor felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Fear. Not fear of loss or failure in the way he understood it, but fear of being seen without armor. The whispers had quieted, replaced by a heavier silence, filled with expectation. People weren't just annoyed anymore, they were watching to see what he would do next, to see if the great Victor Langford would fix it. He couldn't. Sarah Whitman approached again, her voice gentle but firm now. "Sir, we may need to consider—" "No," Victor said, too fast, then softened his tone. "I mean, give me a minute." She nodded and stepped away, but Victor caught the flicker in her eyes. Doubt. Not about his wealth or status, but about his ability to manage this moment. That hurt more than the complaints. Victor looked down at Leo, at the tiny chest heaving with effort, at the tear-streaked cheeks. Guilt washed over him, thick and bitter. He had scheduled this flight between meetings, had told himself Leo wouldn't remember, had assumed everything would fall into place like it always did. He was wrong. The realization settled heavy and undeniable. This problem didn't care who he was. Money couldn't soothe a frightened baby. Influence couldn't buy comfort. Reputation couldn't silence pain. For the first time in decades, Victor had nothing left to leverage. Across the aisle, a woman stood abruptly and walked past without a word, irritation radiating from her. A man scoffed openly. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Each reaction chipped away at Victor's composure until there was almost nothing left to protect. He stared straight ahead, blinking slowly, forcing himself not to react. Pride whispered that he should demand understanding. Ego urged him to remind them who he was, but exhaustion smothered both impulses.
He was just a father now, a failing one, it felt like. From his seat farther back, Mr. Raymond Cole watched Victor's shoulders sag, the transformation subtle but complete. The billionaire wasn't posturing anymore. He wasn't managing optics. He was surviving minute to minute. Raymond's gaze flicked again toward the aisle. The boy was closer now. Charles Williams stood just behind the boundary of first class, his presence tentative but undeniable. He wasn't looking at the passengers. He wasn't looking at Victor's suit or the seats or the symbols of wealth around him. His eyes were locked on Leo, intent, almost troubled, as if he recognized something beneath the noise. Victor didn't see him yet. He was too busy staring at his own hands, noticing how they shook when Leo screamed particularly hard. He swallowed, throat tight, a thought surfacing that terrified him more than the judgment ever could. What if I can't help him? The cry filled the cabin again, louder than before, a sound that carried defeat in its echo. Victor closed his eyes briefly, a rare gesture of surrender. Somewhere behind him, a quiet step moved forward. Victor felt it, not the movement itself, but the shift in the air, the sudden pause in the collective breathing of the cabin. He opened his eyes, confused, and turned his head slightly. For the first time since takeoff, the answer wasn't going to come from him, and he didn't yet know whether that terrified him or saved him.
Charles Williams had been trying not to listen. From his seat in economy, the sound reached him muffled at first, filtered through distance and resignation. Planes were noisy, babies cried, people complained. That was life. He told himself to keep his head down, to stay invisible the way he always did in places like this. But the cry wouldn't let him. It wasn't just loud. It wasn't just constant. There was something uneven about it, something strained that tugged at Charles's attention no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. He shifted in his seat, fingers tightening around the frayed edge of his sleeve, listening despite himself. He'd heard cries like that before, not on planes, not surrounded by luxury and polished voices, but in cramped apartments with thin walls, in waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and fear, in the middle of nights when exhaustion made every sound sharper and every second longer. That cry wasn't anger. It wasn't stubbornness. It was distress. Charles leaned forward slightly, peering down the aisle toward first class. He couldn't see much, just the backs of seats, a flash of a dark suit, the faint movement of someone pacing earlier. The sound rose again, breaking at the edges, and Charles felt his stomach tighten. He knew that sound. It meant something was wrong. Around him, other passengers reacted the way they always did. Someone scoffed, someone complained loudly about paying for a peaceful flight. A woman shook her head and muttered about bad parenting. The words blurred together, familiar and sharp, bouncing off Charles without landing. They weren't listening. Not really. Charles closed his eyes briefly, tuning everything else out. He focused on the rhythm of the cry, the pauses between breaths, the way it escalated when the plane shifted slightly. His mind began to work automatically, the way it always did when he heard that particular kind of sound. Pressure, overstimulation, fear. The baby wasn't fighting the father. The baby was fighting his own body. Charles swallowed. He thought about staying seated, about the looks he'd get if he stood up, about how out of place he already felt just being on this flight. His clothes were clean but worn, his shoes scuffed from too many miles. He could already imagine the suspicion, the irritation, the silent question hanging in the air. What does he think he's doing? He glanced down at his hands. They were steady. That surprised him. The cry surged again, sharper this time, and Charles felt a familiar pull in his chest, a mix of empathy and urgency he'd learned not to ignore. He remembered being told once that some people were just better at hearing certain things. That didn't make them special, it made them responsible. He leaned into the aisle, standing halfway before stopping himself. The boundary between economy and first class loomed ahead, thin and unspoken, but heavy with meaning. He hesitated, heart pounding, eyes flicking toward the flight attendants, toward the passengers who were already irritated by the noise. No one had asked for his help. No one had invited him forward. The cry continued, raw and relentless. Charles exhaled slowly, grounding himself. He wasn't thinking about money or status or rules. He wasn't thinking about what people would say. All he could think about was the baby, small, overwhelmed, trapped in a body that didn't yet know how to cope with the pressure and confusion of the world. He took another step forward. A few heads turned. Someone frowned. Someone else stared openly, annoyance flashing across their face, as if the interruption had now doubled. Charles felt it, the weight of their attention, but he kept his gaze fixed ahead. From his seat farther up, Mr. Raymond Cole noticed him fully for the first time. Raymond watched the boy's posture, the careful way he moved, not entitled, not defiant, just purposeful. He saw something in the boy's eyes that didn't match the assumptions forming around him. Recognition, understanding. Up front, Victor Langford hadn't turned around. Charles stopped just short of the first-class aisle, the cry louder now than ever. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, a gesture more instinct than plan. His voice, when he finally spoke to no one in particular, was barely above a whisper. "He's not being difficult," Charles murmured, almost to himself. "He's scared." The words didn't silence the cabin, but they anchored Charles's resolve. He knew with a certainty that startled him that if he didn't act now, the moment would pass, and the baby would keep crying, and everyone would keep judging, and nothing would change. So Charles took one more step forward. This time, he didn't stop.
Charles's shoes made soft, scuffing sounds against the aisle carpet, but in the tense silence of first class, even that tiny noise seemed loud. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself were reminding him that he did not belong here. Economy and first class weren't just separated by a few rows or a rope. They were separated by expectation, by judgment, by wealth, by history. Crossing that line was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical harm. He could feel it in the stares, sharp, measured, skeptical. Some passengers lifted eyebrows, some whispered to their neighbors. He could almost hear the thoughts forming in their minds. Who does he think he is? What is he doing here? A boy like him shouldn't even be in this part of the plane. Charles kept his gaze forward, locked on the sound of the baby's cries. Leo Langford's wails had become a pulse in the cabin, driving his own heartbeat faster. Each breath from the infant carried urgency, desperation, and a vulnerability that only heightened Charles's determination. He focused not on the disapproval, but on what he had trained himself to notice: the subtle shifts in tension, the sudden tightening of limbs, the sharp inhale that preceded a high-pitched scream. Flight attendants were nearby, hovering, unsure, watching him with a mixture of alarm and disbelief. Sarah Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line as she stepped toward him, raising a hand as if to halt him. "Sir," she started, her voice cautious but firm. Charles shook his head gently, his eyes calm but resolute. He didn't stop. A ripple of murmurs moved through the first-class passengers. Mr. Raymond Cole, seated near the middle of the cabin, watched with keen interest, his eyes narrowing not in judgment but in curiosity. He recognized that something unusual was happening. Most adults would freeze, would hide, would try to look busy, but this boy, he was walking toward the impossible, into a situation that could humiliate or endanger him, and yet there was no hesitation. Charles's steps carried the weight of every moment that had ever taught him empathy. He remembered cramped apartment hallways, nights when he had comforted crying siblings with nothing but his hands and a quiet presence. He remembered learning to calm a storm of emotions with nothing but observation and instinct. This wasn't new. What was new was the audience, the critical, wealthy, judgmental audience who had no idea what he was capable of. Victor Langford sat rigid in his seat, trying once again to rock Leo gently. His suit jacket was wrinkled from tension, his jaw clenched as another failed attempt made the baby's cries rise into a shrill wail. He hadn't noticed Charles at first, caught up in his own frustration and embarrassment, but then the boy's movement drew his eye. The sight of someone from economy walking straight into first class, undeterred by the stares and whispers, made him freeze mid-motion. Charles stopped just a few feet away from Victor, and for a brief moment, time seemed to pause. The baby's cries filled the air, a relentless tide. Flight attendants hovered like guardians, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Passengers held their breath. The invisible line had been crossed, and in its crossing, everything changed. He looked down at Leo, who wriggled in his father's arms, eyes wide with distress. Leo raised his hands slowly, gently, letting his calm energy radiate outward. His voice was soft but steady. "It's okay. I've got you." Victor blinked, confusion and disbelief mingling in his gaze. He had seen nannies, specialists, and doctors try and fail, and yet here was a boy, an ordinary, poor, quiet boy, stepping into first class as if he belonged there, as if he had been meant for this exact moment. The cabin was still tense, still bristling with expectation, but Charles's presence created a pocket of calm in the chaos. The invisible line had been crossed, not just physically, but socially, emotionally, and morally. He had defied the hierarchy without arrogance, without aggression, simply by moving forward with purpose, empathy, and knowledge. As he stood before Leo, ready to act, the murmurs began to fade, replaced by a collective, almost imperceptible pause, the kind that comes when everyone realizes something extraordinary is about to happen. Victor's hands loosened slightly around his son, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The stage was set. And in that moment, Charles Williams was no longer just a boy from economy. He was the catalyst for a miracle, standing on the threshold of the impossible. Charles's shoes made soft, scuffing sounds against the aisle carpet, but in the tense silence of first class, even that tiny noise seemed loud. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself were reminding him that he did not belong here. Economy and first class weren't just separated by a few rows or a rope. They were separated by expectation, by judgment, by wealth, by history. Crossing that line was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical harm. He could feel it in the stares, sharp, measured, skeptical. Some passengers lifted eyebrows, some whispered to their neighbors. He could almost hear the thoughts forming in their minds. Who does he think he is? What is he doing here? A boy like him shouldn't even be in this part of the plane. Charles kept his gaze forward, locked on the sound of the baby's cries. Leo Langford's wails had become a pulse in the cabin, driving his own heartbeat faster. Each breath from the infant carried urgency, desperation, and a vulnerability that only heightened Charles's determination. He focused not on the disapproval, but on what he had trained himself to notice: the subtle shifts in tension, the sudden tightening of limbs, the sharp inhale that preceded a high-pitched scream. Flight attendants were nearby, hovering, unsure, watching him with a mixture of alarm and disbelief. Sarah Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line as she stepped toward him, raising a hand as if to halt him. "Sir," she started, her voice cautious but firm. Charles shook his head gently, his eyes calm but resolute. He didn't stop. A ripple of murmurs moved through the first-class passengers. Mr. Raymond Cole, seated near the middle of the cabin, watched with keen interest, his eyes narrowing not in judgment but in curiosity. He recognized that something unusual was happening. Most adults would freeze, would hide, would try to look busy, but this boy, he was walking toward the impossible, into a situation that could humiliate or endanger him, and yet there was no hesitation. Charles's steps carried the weight of every moment that had ever taught him empathy. He remembered cramped apartment hallways, nights when he had comforted crying siblings with nothing but his hands and a quiet presence. He remembered learning to calm a storm of emotions with nothing but observation and instinct. This wasn't new. What was new was the audience, the critical, wealthy, judgmental audience who had no idea what he was capable of. Victor Langford sat rigid in his seat, trying once again to rock Leo gently. His suit jacket was wrinkled from tension, his jaw clenched as another failed attempt made the baby's cries rise into a shrill wail. He hadn't noticed Charles at first, caught up in his own frustration and embarrassment, but then the boy's movement drew his eye. The sight of someone from economy walking straight into first class, undeterred by the stares and whispers, made him freeze mid-motion. Charles stopped just a few feet away from Victor, and for a brief moment, time seemed to pause. The baby's cries filled the air, a relentless tide. Flight attendants hovered like guardians, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Passengers held their breath. The invisible line had been crossed, and in its crossing, everything changed. He looked down at Leo, who wriggled in his father's arms, eyes wide with distress. Leo raised his hands slowly, gently, letting his calm energy radiate outward. His voice was soft but steady. "It's okay. I've got you." Victor blinked, confusion and disbelief mingling in his gaze. He had seen nannies, specialists, and doctors try and fail, and yet here was a boy, an ordinary, poor, quiet boy, stepping into first class as if he belonged there, as if he had been meant for this exact moment. The cabin was still tense, still bristling with expectation, but Charles's presence created a pocket of calm in the chaos. The invisible line had been crossed, not just physically, but socially, emotionally, and morally. He had defied the hierarchy without arrogance, without aggression, simply by moving forward with purpose, empathy, and knowledge. As he stood before Leo, ready to act, the murmurs began to fade, replaced by a collective, almost imperceptible pause, the kind that comes when everyone realizes something extraordinary is about to happen. Victor's hands loosened slightly around his son, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The stage was set. And in that moment, Charles Williams was no longer just a boy from economy. He was the catalyst for a miracle, standing on the threshold of the impossible.
Charles took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the tense energy of the cabin wash over him and then fade. His hands hovered just above Leo, careful, confident, measured. He could feel the infant's cries vibrating through the air, every wail a pulse of panic and frustration, but he let none of it reach him. Instead, he focused on the small, almost imperceptible movements, the quiver of Leo's tiny fists, the rapid flutter of his eyelids, the sharp intake of breath before another scream. "Easy," Charles whispered, soft enough that only Leo could hear, letting the sound be a gentle invitation rather than a command. His fingers brushed lightly against the baby's back, fingertips tracing a path that somehow grounded the infant's energy. It was subtle, precise, almost ritualistic, a quiet rhythm born of experience, patience, and instinct. Victor Langford's hands loosened further, his eyes wide as he watched Charles work. Every motion was so calm, so deliberate, that it was almost hypnotic. The baby's cries began to falter, the high-pitched urgency softening into whimpers. Passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the change before understanding it. Even Mr. Raymond Cole, who had been skeptical, leaned forward, his eyes widening in disbelief. Time seemed to stretch. A single second dragged into eternity as the first soft coos replaced what had been unbearable screaming. Charles kept his focus, humming a barely audible tune under his breath, the vibration soothing and steady. The air, thick with tension for hours, suddenly seemed to breathe again. Leo's fists unclenched, his limbs relaxed, his eyes, once squeezed tight in distress, slowly opened. For the first time since takeoff, he looked at Charles, not with panic or suspicion, but with curiosity, recognition, and trust. Charles offered a gentle smile, and the baby mirrored it with a small, uncertain coo. A stunned silence fell over the cabin. Passengers froze mid-motion, the usual hum of air conditioning and distant chatter swallowed by the impossible calm. A flight attendant, including Sarah Whitlan, hovered nearby, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Even the pilot's voice over the intercom seemed to pause in anticipation. Victor could barely believe it. He had tried every method, every tool, every ounce of control and wealth at his disposal, and yet it had taken a poor boy from the back of the plane, someone he would have dismissed without thought, to do what no one else could. His chest tightened with a mix of relief, astonishment, and, unexpectedly, gratitude. The silence wasn't just about the baby stopping, it was about something deeper, something unspoken that rippled through every row of seats. Privilege had failed, wealth had failed, authority had failed. What had worked was care, observation, empathy, and courage, the kind that did not need validation or power to exist. Passengers glanced at one another, some sheepishly, others with awe. Whispers began, tentative at first. "Did you see that? How is he doing that? Who is he?" The murmurs grew, spreading like wildfire through the cabin. Mr. Raymond Cole shook his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about human capability and status. Charles held Leo a moment longer, allowing the baby to settle fully against him. Then, with deliberate care, he handed him back to Victor. The billionaire's hands were steadier now, less rigid, more open, almost reverent. Victor's eyes locked with Charles, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, an understanding that had nothing to do with money, influence, or societal hierarchy. Even Sarah Whitman, ever professional and composed, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She had seen many things in her career, but this calm, precise act from a teenage boy was beyond anything she had expected. For a moment, the cabin felt suspended outside time. The routine hum of the plane was still there, but it no longer carried tension. Instead, it carried a quiet energy, a sense that something extraordinary had occurred, that a shift had happened in more than just a child's mood. It was a shift in perspective, in expectation, in the invisible lines people draw between themselves and others. Victor exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and leaned back, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. He looked down at Leo, now calm and cooing softly, then back at Charles, and finally out at the cabin. The passengers were still watching, still silent, but the judgment had evaporated, replaced with amazement. Charles took a small step back, returning to his own space, but the impact of what he had done lingered. He had crossed lines, defied assumptions, and transformed the atmosphere of the flight in a single, quiet act. In the air at 30,000 feet, in the middle of a luxury cabin once dominated by tension and judgment, silence had become something sacred. And in that silence, a lesson had been delivered to everyone present. Greatness is not always measured in wealth, status, or power. Sometimes it is measured in courage, empathy, and the willingness to act when it matters most.
Charles sat back in his seat in economy, the soft hum of the plane a stark contrast to the storm that had just erupted and subsided in first class. His hands still tingled from the connection he had made with Leo, the warmth of the baby's small body lingering in his memory. Yet, as Victor cradled his now calm son and the passengers whispered in disbelief, Charles's mind drifted back to the streets of his childhood, the lessons that had shaped him long before this flight. He had learned early that life often demanded observation where others saw chaos. Growing up in a neighborhood defined by struggle, every sound, every gesture, every shift in emotion carried meaning.
Children learned to read adults the way most people read books, understanding when a moment of calm could avert disaster, when a gentle touch could soothe fear, when precision and patience mattered more than brute force or authority. His mother had taught him this without words, a silent language of care that was survival, a way to bring peace into the lives of those around him even when his own world trembled with uncertainty. Charles remembered nights spent with his younger siblings, crying inconsolably, and how he had instinctively found ways to calm them, rocking, humming, a steady presence that spoke louder than words. It was never about recognition, it was about responsibility. Even at 12, he had understood that the smallest gestures could ripple outward, changing moods, diffusing tension, saving dignity. Every act of quiet attention had been rehearsed in the crucible of necessity, every instinct honed through hardship. It wasn't just a skill, it was a survival mechanism, and now, in the unexpected confines of a first-class cabin at 30,000 feet, it had manifested again. The principles that had once guided him in cramped apartments and overcrowded playgrounds now applied to a screaming infant, a frustrated billionaire, and a judgmental audience of strangers. The tools were the same: observation, timing, subtle pressure, calm energy. What had once been necessity had become mastery. Victor, watching the boy with a mixture of awe and disbelief, had no way of knowing the depth behind the calm confidence Charles had displayed. To him, it seemed miraculous, almost otherworldly. But Charles understood it was far from luck. Every motion, every hum, every precise touch had been rehearsed in the unseen theaters of life, shaped by need, compassion, and the stubborn insistence on making something right when circumstances refused to cooperate. Even Mr. Raymond Cole, whose eyes had tracked Charles's every move, leaned back slowly, the realization dawning that what he had witnessed was not merely instinct, but refined skill forged through adversity. The whispers among the passengers reflected admiration tinged with disbelief, yet none of them could grasp the full story: the countless nights of uncertainty, the quiet victories over chaos, the careful learning born of necessity rather than opportunity. Charles allowed himself a small, reflective smile. It wasn't pride, it never had been. It was understanding, a recognition that his life, difficult as it had been, had prepared him for moments like this. The skill that calmed Leo Langford was the same skill that had allowed him to navigate life with resilience, patience, and empathy, often unnoticed, often unrewarded, yet always present. Even the flight attendants, including Sarah Whitman, who had watched the scene unfold with professional detachment, could sense the subtle mastery at work. She approached afterward, offering a quiet nod, a silent acknowledgement that the boy had done what none of them could, had applied a depth of understanding far beyond his apparent years. Victor's gaze met Charles's briefly, carrying a complex mix of emotions: astonishment, relief, gratitude, and something else: recognition. Recognition that the world was not neatly divided by wealth, influence, or social class. Sometimes the most extraordinary abilities arose from circumstances that forced resilience, empathy, and observation into a person's very bones. In the hushed cabin, Charles reflected that this moment, so public yet so intimate, was a rare confluence of preparation and opportunity. His life had been a series of challenges, each demanding a response, each building skills no textbook or privilege could teach. And now, those skills had not only calmed a screaming infant, but had challenged perceptions, shifted attitudes, and left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The lesson was clear. Expertise is often invisible, cultivated in the shadows of struggle, unnoticed until circumstance demands it. For Charles Williams, the poor boy from economy class, every hardship had been a teacher, every challenge a rehearsal, every act of care a preparation for a moment he could scarcely have imagined. And now that moment had arrived, quietly, profoundly, forever altering the flight and the lives aboard it. As the plane hummed steadily towards its destination, Charles leaned back, the weight of his own story resting lightly on his shoulders. He knew that in this brief encounter, the world had glimpsed only a fragment of what hardship and resilience could achieve, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that the unseen efforts of his life had mattered in a way that was undeniable, transformative, and unforgettable. Victor Langford sat back in his seat, still holding Leo in his arms, but the earlier tension that had clenched his chest like iron had softened into something unfamiliar: humility. The crying had stopped, the cabin was quiet, yet the silence carried weight, a stillness heavy with disbelief. Passengers whispered, exchanged glances, and stole curious looks at the boy who had crossed every boundary uninvited and done the impossible. And Victor, for the first time in years, was acutely aware of how powerless he had seemed. He turned his gaze toward Charles Williams, the teenage boy sitting modestly in economy now, hands folded nervously, posture upright yet unassuming. The boy met Victor's eyes for a fleeting moment, and Victor saw nothing but calm certainty there, the kind that came from a life forged in struggle rather than privilege. "Thank you," Victor said, his voice low but carrying more than politeness. It carried the weight of genuine gratitude, tinged with awe. Charles nodded slightly, humility meeting acknowledgement, and Victor felt a pang of something he hadn't expected: respect. Victor's mind raced as he replayed the events of the past hour. Every ounce of money he had spent, every position of authority, every carefully constructed layer of power, none of it had calmed his son. Every luxury in first class had failed to shield him from judgment. All his accomplishments, his influence, his wealth, had crumbled into irrelevance before a screaming infant and a boy with no wealth, no connections, no standing. And yet here he was, witnessing a simple act of courage and skill accomplish what all his resources could not. He realized then that his life had been ruled by an illusion, the belief that control equaled competence, that power equaled capability, that status could shield him from the chaos of reality. He had built empires on that illusion, but a 6-month-old baby had exposed its fragility in the most public and humiliating way. And the boy, this poor boy, had reminded him that real capability came not from titles or bank balances, but from empathy, observation, courage, and the willingness to act. Victor's chest tightened as he considered how often he had measured people by the wrong standards, judging worth by image rather than substance, dismissing those who lacked prestige or means. The realization struck hard, almost painfully. He had been blind to the hidden strengths in people like Charles, the quiet resilience that often went unseen, the skill honed through hardship and necessity. Leo's calm was more than a momentary miracle. It was evidence of a truth Victor had refused to see, a lesson he could no longer ignore. He glanced around the cabin. Mr. Raymond Cole, ever observant, had been silently recording every expression, every micro-movement, and now even he seemed struck by the shift in energy. The passenger's earlier irritation had given way to admiration, to a tentative acknowledgement that brilliance sometimes arrived without announcement, without fanfare, and without pedigree. Even flight attendant Sarah Whitman seemed to soften, her professional detachment giving way to genuine appreciation for what had just unfolded. Victor exhaled slowly, and a thought occurred to him. Had he ever truly understood power? Had he ever recognized the difference between imposing authority and earning respect, between commanding attention and earning it? He had lived his life surrounded by yes-men and strategic alliances, always moving chess pieces, always controlling outcomes. But here, control had failed him utterly. The boy's success had not been the result of manipulation, persuasion, or influence. It had been the result of patience, skill, and courage, the things money could never buy. Leaning closer to Charles, Victor spoke again, softer this time, a personal acknowledgement, almost reverential. "You've shown me something I needed to see, more than I realized. Thank you."
Charles offered a shy, measured smile, and Victor felt a warmth he hadn't expected, a connection that transcended wealth, age, or status. It was a moment of genuine human recognition, raw and transformative. Victor's eyes shifted to Leo, peacefully nestled against his chest, and he felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond just relief. This was more than his son being calmed, it was an awakening. He had been forced to confront his assumptions, his arrogance, his reliance on privilege, and his limited view of worth. He had been humbled, not by a competitor, not by a market collapse, but by a boy who had nothing and yet had everything that mattered in that moment. The plane hummed quietly around them, but Victor's internal landscape had changed forever. He realized he could no longer measure people by appearances, titles, or wealth. He would never look at life, or at those around him, the same way again. The boy had not just stopped his son's crying, he had shattered Victor's preconceptions, redefined his understanding of value, and reminded him of a truth often forgotten. Greatness is not inherited, purchased, or assumed. It is revealed through action, compassion, and courage, often in the most unlikely of places. As Victor settled back into his seat, a quiet determination took hold. He would carry this lesson forward, not just in how he raised Leo, but in how he saw the world, how he interacted with people, and how he defined success. Charles Williams had done more than help his baby. He had given Victor Langford a gift he could never have bought, and the memory of that act would remain indelible, guiding him long after the plane touched down. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt a profound sense of clarity. Power without understanding was hollow, status without empathy was meaningless, and wealth without humility was fragile. In Charles's quiet courage and skill, Victor had found a mirror reflecting the man he wanted to become, and a reminder that the world was far bigger, far richer, and far more human than he had ever allowed himself to see.
The landing gear rattled as the plane descended, the familiar hum of engines and the distant announcements of the cabin crew mixing with a quiet tension that had settled like a thick fog. Victor Langford's hands rested lightly on the armrests, Leo sleeping peacefully against his chest, a soft weight that now felt grounding rather than burdensome. The flight that had begun as a test of patience and power had transformed into something entirely different, leaving echoes of lessons learned in every corner of the cabin. Charles Williams remained seated, back straight, hands folded neatly on his lap, his gaze focused out the small window beside him. He had done nothing extraordinary in the eyes of the world, just followed instinct, applied skill, but the reverence in the air was palpable. Passengers who had spent hours judging first-class chaos now glanced at him with a new lens, as if seeing him for the first time. Respect had replaced prejudice, and in its place came curiosity, quiet admiration, and for some, a reluctant recognition that appearances were deceiving. Victor exhaled, the first deep, unhurried breath he had taken since the initial scream. He glanced around, noting the subtle shifts. Mr. Raymond Cole's stoic demeanor softened into a nod of acknowledgement. Sarah Whitman's professional mask now carried the faintest smile of genuine pride, and even the other first-class passengers, once impatient and irritable, now held quiet expressions of amazement. The hierarchy of status that had seemed so rigid and unyielding hours ago had dissolved under the simple, undeniable truth that courage and skill are not bound by privilege. Victor caught Charles's eyes across the aisle and gave a subtle nod. It was more than gratitude, it was acknowledgement of equality, a silent message that the boy's actions had mattered in a way that transcended class. For the first time, Victor felt the vulnerability and humility that came with true recognition of another human being. The barriers he had so carefully built in life, the invisible walls of wealth, influence, and authority, seemed less important, almost arbitrary. He had learned that the world could surprise him, that value often lay hidden in places he had ignored, and that sometimes the smallest hands could make the largest difference. As the plane touched down smoothly, the collective sigh of relief from the passengers was tinged with more than just the end of a long flight. It carried awe, respect, and reflection. The quiet murmurs of conversation shifted from complaints to praise, not just for the boy's skill, but for the unexpected way human connection had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Victor's mind replayed the sequence of events, the turning point when a poor boy had crossed an invisible line and with nothing but confidence and understanding had restored peace to a cabin filled with tension. Leo stirred slightly but remained calm, his tiny fingers curling around Victor's hand. The sight was a gentle reminder of how fragile moments can be, how quickly the world can pivot from chaos to grace when the right person acts with intention. Victor pressed a finger to Leo's small palm, feeling a quiet gratitude that went beyond mere relief. This flight had given him far more than a peaceful journey. It had forced him to see the world differently, to reconsider the ways he measured worth, and to confront assumptions he had long carried without question. Charles Williams, unassuming and quiet, had become the unlikely hero of the day. Other passengers approached him now with hesitant questions, subtle nods of approval, and gentle smiles. They had witnessed humility triumph over wealth, skill triumph over expectation, and compassion triumph over prejudice. In this new awareness, the cabin no longer felt divided by class, by privilege, or by preconceptions. It felt connected, if only briefly, by a shared recognition of human potential. Victor turned to Charles as they prepared to disembark, his tone soft but steady. "You've changed more than just this flight," he said, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity. "You've changed me." Charles's eyes met his, and for the first time, the boy didn't shrink under the weight of scrutiny. He had been seen, acknowledged, and respected, not for wealth, not for status, but for who he was and what he could do. The plane slowed along the tarmac, and Victor felt a quiet shift inside himself. Prejudice, pride, and rigid definitions of worth had given way to reflection, respect, and the realization that the world was far more intricate than he had allowed himself to see. The journey had been longer than the hours in the air. It had been a journey into understanding, empathy, and the courage to recognize value where it had previously been invisible. As the doors opened and passengers filed into the terminal, Victor carried Leo gently, Charles at his side, and the quiet hum of transformation lingered in the air. Lives had shifted in a few hours at 30,000 feet, and the plane that carried wealth, tension, and expectation now carried a story of connection, humility, and unexpected heroism. In the eyes of Victor Langford and the passengers around him, something fundamental had changed. Respect had replaced judgment, and a new path, one measured by courage, empathy, and understanding, had quietly opened. For Victor, for Charles, and for Leo, the landing was more than a return to solid ground. It was the start of something different, a life measured not by privilege, but by humanity, a life that, thanks to a boy who dared to act, had been irreversibly transformed. Thank you so much for watching. Your time, support, and love mean the world to me. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. I hope this story touched your heart and reminded you that courage, kindness, and compassion can come from the most unexpected places. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.